Black labor, white wealth. The Search for Power and Economic Justice by Claude Anderson. Chapter 2. Power and Black Progress. Black and power are the oil and water of American politics. Power plays a critical role in black-white race relationships in America. Though we cannot see, taste, or touch it, we can sense its presence and attest to its strength and potency. It affects all manners of human relations. Power, in and of itself, is neutral. Only the motives and purposes of the power's users make power good or bad. It has been abusively used to create divisions between black and white people around the world. A racial and ethnic hierarchy disproportionately distributed nearly 100% control and ownership of wealth, material resources, and privileges to whites at the top of the social order, while blacks assigned to the lowest levels were disproportionately burdened with poverty, powerlessness, and social exclusion. The problem created by those power disparities spawned racial inequalities that only power realignment can correct. Dominant society used its power to label blacks lazy, ignorant, and criminal, then enacted laws that denied them jobs, education, and justice. And throughout the most insidious act of all, dominant societies used its social powers to assign an intensely negative human worth to black skin that caused millions of blacks to fear each other and hate themselves. Black labor, white wealth. The Search for Power and Economic Justice by Claude Anderson. Chapter 2. Power and Black Progress. What is power? Power is defined by Webster's dictionary as the ability to bring about fulfillment of one's desires and needs. Behavioral scientists add another nuisance to the meaning by including in the definition the notion of one entity imposing its will on another. Along the same lines, Thomas Sowell, an economist, defines the term power in a much broader sense in his book, The Economic and the Politics of Race. He added the qualifier that power is not simply the ability to get something done, but to get it done despite the resistance and opposition of others. It is in this last definition of power that is used in this book. A true power holder can enforce its decisions and will on the less powerful by applying or threatening to apply penalties or force. Or it can elect to secure compliance to its wishes and decisions by providing or offering rewards. The final decision on the use of any particular form of social control belongs to the power holder. Those holding power have used it effectively in organizing and controlling blacks to the benefit of the larger society. Power has determined the quality of black life. Social powers external to black communities have controlled and shaped black people's lives and behaviors for more than 4 centuries. The power of the dominant society determines whether blacks will walk proudly as free bushmen of West Africa or toil in chains as slaves among the bushes of America. Dominant society's power made blacks the economic locomotive engine that drove civilizations around the world, but assigned blacks to the caboose so that they could not enjoy the fruits of their own labor. Black labor, white wealth. The Search for Power and Economic Justice by Claude Anderson. Chapter 2: Power and Black Progress. Kinds of Power. To advance the self interest of an individual or a group, humans use numerous kinds of powers. The most common form of power in black white relations are group power, institutional power, wealth power, numerical population power, political power, and voting power. The dominant society uses power mechanisms such as government, private corporations, religious and social institutions to perpetuate its self interest and secure and maintain control of power building resources. Black labor was a wealth builder and therefore a power generating resource that dominant society greatly valued and manipulated. To maintain the power generated by black labor, white society used whatever means necessary to keep blacks powerless and under control. Black labor, white wealth. The Search for Power and Economic Justice by Claude Anderson. Chapter 2: Power and Black Progress. Group power. The United States constitutional spirit of individualism, notwithstanding group power, was the true and base origin of all rights in the American society. Group power is typically manifested when a collective of individuals organize and pool their resources to achieve common goals and share benefits. Such action is the primary instrument for securing objects of interest and power. In the founding years of this nation, European whites built their dreams of becoming a wealthy aristocracy within a capitalistic democracy on the backs of black slaves. The collective power resources of many people, nations, religions, and organizations were aligned and concertedly used to exploit blacks. Their strategy illustrates that group power requires general agreement among the participating members on a core issue, but power evolves from the group's collective motives and goals. Black labor, white wealth, the search for power and economic justice by Claude Anderson. Chapter 2: Power and Black Progress. Institutional power. Institutions arise and exist only by means of group behavior, or institutions center their activities around fundamental social, cultural, academic, racial, religious, or financial needs. They permanently unite a group of people in a cooperative task. Once decisions have been made by a larger society, institutions use their resources to confirm and explain why the larger society made such decisions, and occasionally, institutions are called upon to play leadership roles. Institutions can acquire a variety of power due to their non biological permanency. If financially supported, they survive aging, political shifts, and drastic social changes. An institution's powers are proportioned to and may be measured by its ability to create, store, and circulate data, develop and influence public policies, aggregate people around issues, network with other institutions and organizations, and stimulate the development of leadership. Institutions that can do all of these things well become more powerful. The greatest limitations of institutional power is the lack of transferability of its powers to a particular individual at a particular time on a particular issue. This institutional limitation promotes institutional leadership instead of charismatic personalities. Considering Black America's dire dilemma, the formation of a network of intellectual institutions is imperative for building power bases. Black labor, white wealth, the search for power and economic justice by Claude Anderson. Chapter 2: Power and Black Progress. The impact of institutionalized power on blacks. The superior group power of whites influenced all the institutions they built: government, schools, businesses, churches, and social organizations. Institutions were the means of inculcating values that would perpetually maintain the self interest of European whites and their descendants. Thus, institutional power has become a major factor in maintaining the power imbalance between blacks and whites. Government was one of the most powerful tools of the dominant society. Without the support and power of government, the white society could not have enslaved and segregated blacks for centuries. Government, for example, enacted laws that forbade schools to accept black children and made it illegal to teach a black person to read or write. Initially, all formal religious denominations accepted the abuse of blacks and even offered biblical justifications for it. Though through government, businesses, churches, and other institutionalized power holders, white society controlled the wealth, power, and resources. They also controlled blacks, their primary labor source. Black labor, white wealth, the search for power and economic justice by Claude Anderson. Chapter 2: Power and Black Progress. Wealth, power. Economic power has always been the greatest source of power for individuals and groups in America. Individuals who merge their political and financial resources into a group can become very powerful in a capitalistic democracy. For instance, Jews and white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, WASP, have uncontested control over a disproportionate share of America's wealth. Wealth gives them options. They use their wealth as political tools to open doors to new economic opportunities for their respective group, to punish others, and to block the doors of opportunity. Obviously, all whites do not possess great wealth and power, but because of their strong sense of racial cohesion and their compulsive beliefs in keeping economic resources within their communities, the resources of wealthy and powerful whites stay within the white community. They rarely help non-whites, especially blacks. Chancellor Williams, in his book, The Destruction of Black Civilization, wrote, "Caucasians will wage frightful wars against other Caucasians, but will quickly unite as though by instinct against non-whites, not only in wars, but in international policies. They have developed a kind of built-in solidarity in their relations with non-Caucasian peoples. This fact, as much as anything else, helps to explain their position as masters of the world. Together, wealth and politics represent a potent combination of power because they are versatile, and by working together, they can produce other forms of power. They are the root cause of racial stratification, exploitation, and the unequal distribution of resources. In the present social structure, maldistribution guarantees that America will never be an equal opportunity society. Those who hold a disproportionate share of wealth and power are not inclined to share or relinquish these tools. In combination, political power and wealth become practically synonymous in a capitalistic democracy. Since wealth remains concentrated and rigidly locked in the hands of whites, black progress will be difficult. As far back as 1790, the richest 10% of white households has held half of the nation's wealth. By the eve of the Civil War, 1% of the most wealthy whites owned 24% of the nation's wealth. 100 years later, in 1969, they owned 24.9%. During the very same time period, black wealth remained between 1 and 2%. It is astounding that the percentages of wealth controlled by whites or blacks have not changed throughout this nation's involvement in the Civil War, emancipation of the slaves and Reconstruction, World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, Korean and Vietnam Wars, and the Civil Rights Movement, which was followed by a second Reconstruction period. Through it all, the wealthy white elite collectively held on to everything. According to census report, the great disparity between blacks and white wealth and income levels continues to increase. The U.S. Department of Commerce Bureau of the Census in 1986 reported that an average white household has 10 times more wealth than the average black household. The wealth gap is so large that the three richest white Americans, with a collective net worth of $15 billion, had a great financial net worth that all black businesses combined. The major driver of the wealth and income gap between blacks and whites is the maldistribution of poverty. The poverty level for blacks is 3 times that of whites and Hispanics. Nearly 1/3 of blacks are classified as poor, and 50% of all single black female head of households are poverty stricken. Poverty is a power impeder. Black labor, white wealth. The Search for Power and Economic Justice by Claude Anderson. Chapter 2. Power and Black Progress. Numerical population power. In a democratic society, the numerical majority wins, rules, and decides. The theoretical rights of a minority may or may not be respected, especially if they are planned minority. Numerical population power is the power that comes to those groups that acquire power through their sheer size. The black population peaked in the 1750s when slaves and free blacks accounted for approximately 33% of the total population. The high numerical strength of blacks caused fear and concern among whites. They feared the loss of their own numerical power. Word of black Haitians' successful slave revolts in 1790 had spread across America and reportedly ignited several slave revolts in southern states. The first U.S. Congress enacted the first naturalization law that declared America to be a nation for whites only. This Naturalization Act and other income incentives attracted a mass influx of legal and illegal European ethnics, followed by Asians and Hispanic immigration in a century later. The immigration quota on blacks remained zero until their total percentage of the population declined to 9%. By making blacks a planned numerical minority, white society assured its dominance in a democratic society where the majority always wins. Black labor, white wealth, the search for power and economic justice by Claude Anderson. Chapter 2, Power and Black Progress. Political power and its supportive concepts. Political power comprises all of those activities that relate to the authoritative uses of public and governmental powers under existing traditions, laws, and constitutional authorities of government. But political power can be acquired either through or outside of the normal process of elective or appointed office. Political power is an important power for a depressed group to have because politics is the process that typically decides who shall have what benefit in life. However, groups aspire to gain political power can only obtain and use it if they have economic power as well. Economic power allows a group to possess and exercise control over its own power rather than seeking access to another's power. Black labor, white wealth, the search for power and economic justice by Claude Anderson. Chapter 2, Power and Black Progress. Voting illusionary power. Voting in public held elections is a key source of power in any democratic society if the voting group has certain collaterate forms of power. Emancipation and amendments to the Constitution gave blacks the legal right to vote. Probably the only instance in which blacks exercise true group power is through block voting. But without wealth, numerical, or social accountability powers, voting becomes a weak form of power for blacks. Voting rights have pacified blacks for allowing them to make choices, but never decisions. They could only vote their choice of candidates about whom the dominant white society has already made decisions. The weakness of black voting power was demonstrated when a white anti-Reconstruction backlash in the South took voting rights from blacks within a generation after they were granted in mid-1860s. It took nearly another century to restore blacks' access to the ballot box. Since the 1960s, blacks' consistent level of voter participation indicated that they steadfastly believe that their voting power can significantly change their life conditions. This will not happen through much effort, and expenses go into black voter registration and get out the vote project. Blacks have successfully put black and white candidates into high governmental offices by voting in blocks. But blacks have failed to buttress their block voting with other forms of group power building activities. Voting itself is a limited, transitory form of power that ends with the polls close. With a block vote, blacks may cast the decisive votes that put a candidate into office, but they cannot make the new office holder deliver. Threats can be made, but voting power cannot be exercised outside the ballot box. Since elections are held every 2 to 4 years, the black electorate can be ignored or further damaged by those they put into public office. Blacks' limited income and wealth encourage them to support their political candidates with campaign worker and votes at the ballot box. But he who pays the piper calls the tune. Black communities in recent years have failed to use their limited financial power and resources to persuade outside forces to create change inside black communities. One of the most noteworthy times that they did was the Alabama bus boycott. Beyond doubt, it was more effective than the ballot box. When money stopped flowing from black to white hands, the white society in Alabama listened and changed a little. Even when blacks vote blacks into public office, their ballot box victories do not necessarily translate into improved social and economic conditions for black people. Some black elected officials have been reluctant to initiate programs solely targeted to blacks. Many have been convinced that we live in a colorblind society and are simply afraid to push for black causes. Thus, black political power has yet to become an effective strategy for getting vitally needed resources to black communities. Though the rule of the politics is something for something, black Americans are never specifically rewarded for their overwhelming support for candidates for public office. Black officials are skittish about using the power of their offices to specifically address the needs of black communities because they are concerned about generating a white backlash. It's easier for them to propose or support programs that are ambiguously designed to assist everybody rather than just blacks. For their political support, blacks have always been denied quid pro quo or something in return for their votes. Some black office holders, like their white political counterparts, practice trickle down politics. They demonstrate their productivity to blacks by pointing to legislation and programs that they supported for civil rights, poor people, minorities, the homeless, immigrants, prison reform, and public works. Few can point to a program or policy that was enacted specifically and solely to relieve the horrendous conditions in black communities. At nearly every level of government and in corporate America, there are some programs or policies that target women, Indians, Asians, Hispanics, handicapped, and other or aggrieved groups. Once black elected officials buy into the idea of supporting measures to assist everybody, they have, in effect, eliminated the importance of having a black elected office. Mainstream programs and policies have merely maintained the status quo, leaving blacks in the same status that they were in before blacks were elected or appointed to public office. Since 1960, there has been a sizable increase in the number of black elected officials, an 8,000% increase to be more specific. As indicated in Table 1, black conditions have either remained the same or worsened. Black per capita income compared to white per capita income went up over the last two decades, but the gap between poor and middle class blacks widened. The 8,000% rise in the number of black elected officials did little to impede the steady increase of blacks entering the criminal justice system. Poverty, homelessness, unwed mothers, drug abuse activity, or homicide rolls. Likely without the increased numbers of black elected officials, black conditions would be even worse today. Yet it is a dramatic statement about the dire conditions of black America that it took an 8,000% increase in blacks elected to public office to keep blacks where they had always been. Many blacks Many black elected officials bewail their inability to change the conditions of blacks. The nation's 36 million blacks are a sleeping giant that, if properly organized and mobilized, could achieve group economics and political power. However, in order to do so, black disposable income must be just as organized and selectively spent as black votes are cast during the election. James Jennings, a writer and observer of black political activism, summarized the fallacy that voting results in political power for blacks. Voting in itself is not power, nor is having black elected and appointed officials power. These phenomena become power only when they can be used to influence and affect the behavior of white society and others. Black labor, white wealth, the search for power and economic justice by Claude Anderson. Chapter 2, Power and Black Progress. The importance of power for black people. Without increased wealth and political power, blacks cannot correct the multitude of social ills that have become embedded in the fabric of their communities, nor can they acquire the power they need through a shared power arrangement with the dominant white society. The dominant society will not permit blacks to use their power within white institutions to improve social and economic conditions within black communities, especially since whites as a group generally have neither the interest nor incentives for correcting the conditions. Consequently, blacks must develop their own group and institutional powers, then remedy the inequalities that have been historically imposed upon them. Progress has eluded black people because they have been powerless to get what they wanted and needed, and they have not been able to stop others from depriving them of the necessities of life. Since slavery in the 1954 desegregation decision, blacks have experienced political and civil right improvements. Blacks have related free access to voting booths and voted for any candidate that the power structure offers. They have access to public restrooms, lunchroom counters, and the front seat on any bus. However, civil rights did not bring about much change in their ability to pay for the best facilities or seats. Civil rights have been ineffective for most blacks in terms of improving substandard housing, lowering their unemployment rate, transforming dysfunctional schools, removing massive poverty, reducing high crimes, or eliminating social rejections by whites, Asians, Hispanics, and other ethnics. Black social and economic progress will come about only when blacks muster the power and the commitment to bring forth positive change. Black Labor, White Wealth: The Search for Power and Economic Justice by Claude Anderson. Chapter 2: Power and Black Progress. Black Self-Empowerment, the Only Road Open. Self-empowerment is the most effective, if not the only road open for blacks to reach racial competitiveness. But the first issue is to resolve a common understanding of what the term self-empowerment means. Since the 1960s, the term has been used in unclear and even contradictory ways. The American Heritage Dictionary defines empowerment to invest with legal power or to authorize. This definition speaks to institutionalized authorities and powers. Quite clearly, this is not what Black activists intended when they spoke of empowering Black people and Black communities in the 1960s. Most community activists were concerned about empowering Black people to act in or be in a position to speak for their own people through establishing systems. Today, it is politically correct to espouse empowerment zones in minority communities throughout the nation. According to one federal official, empowerment zones, empowerment zone monies would be invested in infrastructure improvements and preferential tax incentives would be offered to white businesses in order to attract them into the very same Black communities that they began abandoning 30 years ago. How do infrastructure improvement and tax incentives for white wealth holders help Blacks? Is the term empowerment zones used to mean Black empowerment? Or is the term empowerment zones used to mean self-empowerment? If so, how? Who is really being empowered, and how will what the government proposes to do eradicate Black communities' dire conditions? Self-empowerment for Blacks can only occur when Blacks use all of their available resources to acquire wealth and social power through a comprehensive plan involving all segments of their communities. A proper development self-empowerment plan that is supported in principle by all of Black America could change centuries of deferring dreams into realized visions. Until Black America collectively aspires to acquire its own power to alter its marginal condition, it is highly unlikely that they will ever obtain power. A plan for self-empowerment must begin with a realistic analysis of Blacks' assets and lead to the development of strategies and maximize their fullest potential. True empowerment would give Blacks new tools and strengths to deal with the power imbalance that today promote racism in the court system, educational institutions, as well as the government and private corporate sectors. These entities have no accountability to Blacks, even though they exert tremendous power over Blacks. They are Tories of the cultural power of whites. They have not changed through the centuries, thus they still safeguard the culture, heritage, and social values of original European settlers. Black Labor, White Wealth: The Search for Power and Economic Justice by Claude Anderson. Chapter 2: Power and Black Progress. Organize and power will come. A great writer once said, "Those who the gods would make powerful must first organize." Few words could be truer for blacks. Whether individual blacks are firm believers in the concept of integration, segregation, or moderation, they must all come together around the goal of improving the living conditions of their race. Although political and other philosophies may differ, blacks and united by their physical commonality. Divided, they cannot achieve empowerment. They will be unable to make effective decisions about their future. Blacks are no longer in servitude. They have a protected right to exercise their freedom of association. They may freely organize in their own best interests. No other ethnic or racial group will organize for nor represent blacks' interest. Society is competitive and becoming increasingly more pluralistic, and there are no incentives for others to assist black people. A plan for organizing will not be spontaneously materialized. Blacks must organize in order to direct their own future and long term best interest. In the past, blacks organized to address specific issues that aggrieved them. The resultant organizations therefore lacked permanence. When the issue or the leader died, so did the organization, regardless of its effectiveness. Consequently, blacks have historically been caught in the constant cycle of reorganizing. Moreover, most black single issue organizations have lacked the human or financial capital to provide a forceful, continuous, adaptive, and sustained fight strictly on behalf of blacks. Though Jews are a minority religious group, they can serve as an empowerment model. Jews wield strong blocks of power, financial and political, that result from their strong sense of community, control of wealth, and organizational network. Under their religious identification and sense of togetherness, they aggressively protect their domestic and international interests regardless of criticism. Unlike blacks, they openly and aggressively use their power to tilt the government and private resources to support issues and programs that benefit Jews. As a religious minority, Jews understand that in a government that is based on the belief of being of, by, and for the people are those who can concentrate their power and get what they want. Harold Cruse, the historian, criticized blacks' failure to develop new organizational leadership for collective decision making. Using Jews as a model of organizing, Harold Cruse lamented that history has taught Jews that without a strong, purposeful organization, there was little chance for survival in a hostile world. To this very day, blacks have not learned this lesson. Blacks are a sleeping giant with some limited potential for developing economic and social power. But regardless of the limited natural nature of their potential, group power operates upon the very simple principle that whoever is organized has already established a minimum level of power that they did not have as a scattered people. Blacks seeking to empower themselves will undoubtedly create concerns among whites who have grown accustomed to the historical belief that blacks should always be a powerless, poverty stricken people. Although It appears that the dominant society would be more comfortable with American Indians, Asians, or Hispanics seeking increased group power. The black race is not so weak that it cannot develop the limited potentials for group power that up until now have been acquired by them only through chance and historical circumstance. As a powerless group, blacks have at least two choices. They can seek self empowerment through incremental structural changes, or they can seek to share with those groups that already have it. Blacks, to a large degree, have taken the latter route and have looked for access to white power holders for a stake of power. This decision was a natural outgrowth of the slavery for conditioning process, as explained later in Chapter 7, which taught blacks to align their interests with the interests of the master. The social phenomenon is apt demonstrated both in the behavior of Sambo in Uncle Tom's Cabin and the real life acts of black conservatives. At best, access to power allows the power seeker the opportunity of being near the power holder and to secure personal benefits or limited benefits for the needful masses. In seeking to share power with whites, blacks must understand the drawback that the request for power to improve their conditions must always be passed through and approved by the social and political forces of the major white power holders, who are rarely generous to blacks in their decision making. As James Jennings in his book The Politics of Black Empowerment stated, for all groups in a giving society, the prospect for improved incomes, greater holdings of property, and more favorable life chances generally is profoundly influenced by the group's relationship to instruments of power. This means the ability of blacks to use all those sanctions, rewards, and inducements and methods that people in the advanced society use to control their environment and influence the behavior of others. Unity or group power is the most important ingredient in the advancement of a racial group. Group power is essential to make the most of blacks' access to power as they endeavor to acquire power itself. Black labor, white wealth, the search for power and economic justice by Claude Anderson. Chapter 2, Power and Black Progress. Progress follows empowerment. For black progress to occur, there must be a fundamental redistribution of wealth and poverty in America. They are burdened by too much planned impoverishment. Blacks cannot amass power from their individual holdings of wealth until they organize and develop a plan that will attract and retain wealth within black communities. Nearly every black community suffers from historical deprivation, low income levels, and the flight of black capital and disposable income to white suburbs. The income that does remain in black communities, usually between 2 and 5%, is insufficient to maintain public services, support businesses, stimulate employment opportunities. It cannot support a political structure dedicated to advancing black interests nor garner respect from other competitive racial or ethnic groups. Black labor, white wealth, the search for power and economic justice by Claude Anderson. Chapter 2: Power and Black Progress. Organize and thinking strategically. It must be clarified that the possession of power does not guarantee wealth. Not nor does wealth always guarantee power, but contrarily, the lack of power can guarantee poverty, and poverty can always guarantee powerlessness. Controlling resources, maintaining a strong sense of community, and good organizational planning can produce both power and wealth. It is the American way to organize groups for the purpose of acquiring and wielding power. While most groups realize that there is strength in numbers, apparently, according to one study, some blacks do not necessarily see strength in grouping themselves with other blacks. In a study of group power, Evans and Gills reported that increased concentrations of blacks served to generate higher levels of ethnocentrism among blacks and raise fear among whites. The lower the percentage of blacks in the workplace, for instance, the lower whites feel fear that blacks will acquire power. This is an important finding and raises questions about the wisdom of integration. If race relations are based on power, the more blacks integrate into white society, the less chance they have to acquire power. Blacks' willingness to dilute their own strength destroys any perception of their having power. The perception of power is the first step towards the reality of power. The Evans and Gill study revealed significant findings that have impact on group power for blacks. The authors found that blacks did not conceptualize their potential for group power, and more detrimental, blacks may actually perceive their group power to diminish when higher concentrations of blacks are present. These perceptions of racial concentration and power are exactly the opposite of whites. Whites establish barriers, legal and otherwise, to ensure their superior numbers and power. Blacks believe that something may be wrong when large numbers of them come together without the presence of whites can probably be traced to the conditioning process of slavery, which taught blacks to see themselves through the eyes of a white person, thus reversing years of self depreciating thinking, low self esteem, and slave conditioning, and organizing to achieve group empowerment goals will require careful strategic planning. Blacks must organize around new principles and purposes in order to confront the political and economic realities facing them. To their credit, black intellectuals in the ante and post-bellum periods did try to organize and plan. They shared resources and demonstrated some community oriented accountability by establishing planning forums and advocacy organizations through churches and benevolent societies. Their effectiveness was limited by the meager financial and material resources and lack of access to power sources. However, they had an impact on the attitudes of the black masses, especially during the most oppressive times. Some noteworthy planning organization that were singularly committed to black people were established during several historical periods: the Negro Conventional Movement in 1830, the Niagara Movement in 1905, the African Community League in 1914, the United Negro Improvement Association in the early 1900s, and the National Negro Congress in 1936. Clearly, blacks felt a recurring need for national planning and research, but there was no common acceptance goal or established public policies for blacks. Differing philosophies and political personalities confused the issue and bogged down the organizations. In the recent past, blacks organized over specific issues such as discrimination, crime, unemployment, or voting rights. As stated earlier, the organizations either faded when the issues faded or lost potency and became non threatening advocacy groups. They found it easier to organize advocacy groups whose narrow focus did not appear as threatening to establish power. On the One of the first known and longest lasting attempts by blacks to establish a national planning group was the Negro Convention movement, which began in 1830 and continued through the Civil War. Black leaders throughout the North got together to identify problems, develop policies, and speak as a united voice. This movement was followed by the Niagara movement. In 1905, W.E.B. Du Bois, John Hope, Maurice Trotter, and other vocal young black intellectual met in Niagara Falls in Ontario, Canada, and founded the Niagara Movement. This organization was primarily political in its objectives. Its leaders strove to seize the leadership of Black America from the more conciliatory emphasis of Booker T. Washington. Further, they wanted to establish a platform from when to condemn the white prejudice that they found all about them. They hoped to resurrect the spirit of the angry abolitionist leadership that preceded the Civil War. In the early 1920s, chapters of the United Negro Improvement Association sprung up all over the nation. It was the largest mass organization in Black history. Marcus Garvey led the organization advocating race redemption, Black pride, Black identity, and Black solidarity in the African homeland. Garvey followers were a group of young Blacks who were disenchanted with the NAACP and the National Urban League unwillingness to develop meaningful policies and programs to uplift the economically depressed masses. They organized the National Negro Congress, whose membership included aggressive men such as Ralph Bunche and A. Philip Randolph. Members of the National Negro Congress knew that if they did not plan their future, the white power elite most certainly would. And any plans by whites to improve conditions for blacks would be at black people's expenses. Nearly half a century after the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power Movement, there is still no national black policy or plan for black self-sufficiency or empowerment. Since such a plan would singularly benefit blacks, it is Black America's responsibility to build an organization that will develop a national plan. The organization should be an intellectual infrastructure that would not only develop the plan, but would analyze and craft roadmaps to get Black America out of its marginal existence and into a social economic competitive position with other racial and ethnic groups. Black labor, white wealth. The Search for Power and Economic Justice by Claude Anderson. Chapter 2, Power and Black Progress. Strategic leveling of the playing field. Decision making through strategic planning is the wave of the future. The decision to organize and plan is the first step towards acquiring power and increased control over resources. By organizing for self sufficiency, self empowerment, and racial accountability, blacks make a conscious decision to both effect and be responsible for their own future. Blacks have paid dearly for entrusting their future to non blacks. If the lesson has been learned, then it is not too late for blacks to begin leveling the competitive playing field to avoid being locked into a permanent underclass status among racial and ethnic groups in the hyper competitive decade ahead. Decision making is based in choosing between the probable and the possible. More specifically, blacks must identify and choose preferred paths based upon their historical experience, present conditions, and future needs. If blacks ignore these factors and continue to be non involved as a group, it is highly probable that they will get stuck in non preferred paths in the future. More to the point, there is a rule of human behavior that states that if we continue to do the same thing that we have always done, then we will continue to get the same results that we have always gotten. If blacks want different results and an improved quality of life, they must make different decisions as a group. Once blacks design a national plan, even if the plan fails initially, blacks will have at least improved their image as an organized group of people interested in an improved future. The protracted powerlessness and poverty of Black America are the results of planning, not chance. The planning was not done by blacks. In 130 years that blacks have had their legal freedom, they have not had collective long term planning for public policies for black people. Blacks are concerned about the future of black youth, but 16 generations of blacks have had to grow up without the benefit of organized lives within a national plan. Professor Harold Cruz prophesies that without a functional philosophy for coping with American realities of white racism, each successive generation of black youth would be born, evolved, hesitant, pondered, preserved, and floundered into the blind anonymity of deferred dreams and frustrated hopes. Cruz's prophecy is being manifested across this nation in the daily statistics on black youth violence and death. Black Labor, White Wealth: The Search for Power and Economic Justice by Claude Anderson. Chapter 2: Power and Black Progress. Conclusion: Blacks have made little relative progress from slavery to today because we still have not acquired the necessary sources of power to create positive change in our marginal conditions. People who use their individual means to build collective wealth and power understand that there is strength in numbers. Blacks have yet to recognize or act upon this truth. The black vote alone will not ensure blacks a respectable status or new role in America. The vote must be backed by a national plan of public policies specifically designed to help blacks achieve economic self-sufficiency and self-empowerment.